Actuator support for Redis dependent on Spring data. Actuator support for Elasticsearch. Endpoint support. Annotation support for actuator endpoints. Interfaces and classes relating to invoking operation methods. Converter support for actuator endpoints. Endpoint reflection support. Caching support for actuator endpoints. Jackson support. Classes for actuator endpoints, JMX support for actuator endpoints, annotation support for actuator JMX endpoints, web support for actuator endpoints, annotation support for actuator web endpoints, Jersey support for actuator endpoints, Spring WebFlux support for actuator endpoints, Spring MVC support for actuator endpoints, actuator support for Spring Frameworks environment, actuator support for Flyway, actuator support for Hazelcast, actuator health indicator and endpoints, actuator support for InfluxDB, classes for application info, actuator support for Spring integration, actuator support for JDBC, actuator support for JMS, actuator support for LDAP, actuator support for Liquibase, actuator support for logging, actuator support for Java Mail, actuator support for JVM management, core actuator support for metrics, actuator support for RabbitMQ, Java client metrics, support classes for handler method metrics, actuator support for cache metrics, actuator support for Spring Data repository metrics, actuator support for exporting metrics to Prometheus. Support classes for HTTP-related metrics, actuator support for JDBC metrics, actuator support for ALS2 DBC metrics, actuator support for starter metrics, actuator support for system metrics, actuator support for web client metrics, actuator support for Jetty metrics, actuator support for web client metrics, actuator support for WebFlux metrics, actuator support for Spring MVC metrics, actuator support for Tomcat metrics, actuator support for Neo4j, actuator support for Quartz scheduler, actuator support for R2DBC, actuator scheduling support, actuator support for security, actuator support for Spring Season, actuator support for application startup, actuator support for system-related concerns, actuator HTTP exchanges support, actuator HTTP exchanges support for reactive servers, actuator HTTP exchanges support for servlet servers, actuator web request mapping support, actuator reactive request mapping support.